but I want to introduce my friend, Michelle Ringuette, who is taking over responsibility for running this panel, facilitating this panel in the absence of Randy. Michelle is the assistant to the president for labor, government, and political affairs at the AFT. She's been active for many more years than she cares to remember, I'm sure, in fights for social, economic justice and human rights. She's worked in SCIU, in Catholics for Choice, Amnesty International, and among her most important work is the work that she's done against the NRA and gun violence and to protect women's reproductive freedom and safety. Michelle and the rest of the panel, come on up.
All right, is this live? Am I live? Can you hear me? Terrific. Okay, first of all, thank you for being here. I think this is an extraordinarily important discussion that we have to have today. You can't hear me. Is the mic not on? Oh, there it is. Okay. So again, thank you all for being here. It's critically important that we're having this discussion. First and foremost, I have to thank Secretary Clinton. It is such a gift to hear you on this subject. And I also want to thank you for the life of service that you have led, which is such an inspiration to so many of us, but also really a call to action for everyone in this room and who's watching on the live stream, that if we really want to preserve our democracy in this time of peril, it's going to take stepping forward and engaging in an active way and recognizing that we each must do our part. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you for your words and your encouragement and your leadership. I would also be remiss not to mention that this was the brainchild of Randy Weingarten and Leo Casey. You've certainly heard many descriptions of the extraordinary work they've done, and I won't go over that again, but I will say that as someone who works with Randy side by side, I know no one who is more committed to making sure that both the labor movement and the work for public education is truly about inspiring and creating engaged citizens from the earliest age up into like retirement and beyond. That it is so critically important to her that our union uses every resource it has to be in the fights right now. So that ranges from our work on gun violence prevention to promoting public education for the entire country, that children have the opportunity, that public education's fully funded, that people have access to health care, that we show up, we care, we fight, we show up, and we vote, which is, I mean, there are t-shirts all over our union bearing this slogan. And I think that to understand AFT, you really have to understand that our 1.7 million members who are educators, who are nurses and healthcare professionals, who are in higher ed, who are public servants, that they have invested their time and energy in a union that has become about really trying to improve the lives of people who get up and go to work every day, and that we are trying to give our members the tools so that they can make better lives for their families, but also the communities they live in. And we see that as making sure they have a voice both at work and in their democracy. So with that aside, I want to take a moment to quickly introduce our panel, and then we're going to get into a discussion. Sorry, I'm being told that my mic is not in the right place, so I might hold it in a second. So I'm going to do a quick introduction. We're going to do a discussion. We're going to also open it up to the audience, so think about your questions as you're listening today. So thank you. To my right, we have Leah Greenberg, who is a co-founder of Indivisible. Thank you. To Leah's right, and none of this is politically, of course, just physically, we have Guerra Lamarche, who is the head of the Democracy Alliance. Next to Guerra, we have Amanda Turkle, who is the Washington bureau chief for the Huffington Post. And of course, next to Amanda, we have Joy Reid, who you see every weekend on MSNBC and also almost nightly. All right, thank you all so much for being here. My first question is actually going to give them each an opportunity to introduce themselves, but also talk a little bit about the work they've done and what they have seen, what they think we should have seen, or the signposts that we might have missed along the way. Because I think that, as the title of this panel indicates, that we are truly in a moment of peril for American democracy. And that said, we are also in a moment where civic participation is more important than almost any time in our living memories. And so, obviously, as devastating as 2016 was for many of us, I think we recognize that it was the culmination and then the onward growth of seeds that were planted a number of years ago. And maybe in our various institutions, that work started earlier, but it did not happen overnight that our institutions were weakened, that our civil dialogue became more coarse and more vituperative. It also was not accidental that the labor movement has had its legs cut out from under it and been under constant attack to deny people collective voice at work. And there's been strategic austerity in a number of our cities and states, which have certainly led to a dearth of things that are so vitally important, like civics education in our schools and opportunities for students to develop critical thinking skills. And again, this is like, there are no shortage of examples, and I'm going to turn it over to the panel to really talk through that. So first, Leah, I'm going to throw it out to you. As someone who has co-founded a signature marquee organization designed to giving citizens a voice, but also with your background of working on the Hill for a member of Congress, could you tell us a little bit both about yourself, the work you're doing, and also specifically talk about what you saw along the way, both inside government and now outside?
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you again, Secretary Clinton, for the opportunity to be here today. My mic working okay? All right. So I would say that a lot of the lessons that I drew on in co-writing the Indivisible Guide, which served as an early manual for activism in the post-2016 period, and which led us to found an organization dedicated to supporting people who had gotten politically active during that period. I learned from working on Capitol Hill during the early Obama years for a member of Congress, Tom Peril, who represented a deep red district and who was attempting to vote in a progressive direction in the face of a very active Tea Party insurgency in that district. The Indivisible Guide was explicitly about lessons that we had taken from watching the activism of the Tea Party. We disagreed with basically everything about them, but we thought that they had a whole set of lessons, many of them taken from Saul Alinsky, that we could then turn around and use ourselves in a moment when we didn't control any of the federal government. One of the other things that I think was really central, or one of the other key formative lessons for me in observing the Tea Party, because I was a junior staffer, I was answering phones, I was staffing events, I was giving Capitol Hill tours to members of the Tea Party because a surprising number of people would turn up to our office and yell at us and then be like, I'm here for my Capitol tour. You know, we would be, basically what was really clear in interacting with them was, you know, there was all this focus on the deficit or on taxes, but that was actually really not the animating fear, that was not the animating motivation. There was this deeper anger, there was this deeper sense of the country that they recognized not slipping away from them. There was outrage and sort of a fundamental belief that the first black president was not legitimate, that the political coalition that had put him in office was not legitimate. There was a sort of illiberalism that was animating and white nationalism that was animating a lot of their focus. And that often didn't necessarily get picked up and recognized within the broader political dialogue. And I think it's not an accident, right, that immediately after sort of massive victories in Republicans in the 2010 election, there was another wave of voter suppression that began to pick up at that point. I think that it was really important to us as we founded Indivisible and as we were working on our activism over the last couple of years to really draw draw the connections here to say that Trump had risen to office, not out of nowhere, but on the force of sort of an illiberal political current that had been under the surface for a really long time, that his secret had been throwing out the dog whistles that Republicans had used in politics and then using a bullhorn instead. And that he was also drawing on currents within the Republican Party that have consistently focused on taking power and then using that power to disenfranchise opponents, to disenfranchise people of color, to go after civil society, to undermine the institutions that actually protect a representative democracy. And so that's that's how I kind of connect the threads from the early experiences that we had that led us to the guide to the moment that we're currently in.
Thank you, Leah. Guerra, I'm going to turn it over to you now. And for those of you who don't know, Guerra, probably as much as anyone, has a sense of the landscape around the progressive infrastructure. Before that, Guerra also worked at the Pan American Center and had done significant work on human rights and civil liberties around the country and indeed around the world at a time. So, Guerra, talk to us a little bit about what we have seen institutionally and also how it ties to other things you've seen in trends around the world.
Sure. How's my mic? Okay, great. I'll put it initially, as Leah did, kind of in autobiographical terms, although I have a much longer autobiography. I'll try to keep it very short. I started out life 4 decades or so ago, not life, but work, as the, unfortunately, not my life is, or fortunately, my life is longer than 4 decades, with the American Civil Liberties Union. I worked for the ACLU for a dozen or so years. In Texas, running the Texas ACLU, in New York in the national office. And then I went in for, I don't know, the next couple of decades into work that was more globally focused. And my specialty, as it turns out, I didn't really see it this way at the time, and like a lot of people's careers, there was serendipity that makes sense in retrospect, but not necessarily in prospect. I ended up being the person who expanded the work of various global organizations to the United States. And so my first job after Civil Liberties Union was running the Freedom to Write program at Penn, the writers' organization, right at the time of the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. But also at the same time, many people don't remember it as well, there was an assault from the Bush administration, NEA, on the rights of artists in the United States, and there was a wave of book banning and so on. So Penn, which was a global human rights organization and a literary organization that was used to focusing on what was happening to writers who were persecuted in the former Soviet Union or in Vietnam or around the world, was all of a sudden focused on the United States because it needed to be. Then I went to Human Rights Watch in 1990 at the very relatively early days of Human Rights Watch, which again had been an organization focused on the one hand on the former Soviet sphere and human rights violations there, and also increasingly on Latin America and the rest of the world, but realized, in contrast to its early inclinations, where it thought, well, you have the ACLU and the Legal Defense Fund and all these groups take care of the United States, we can focus elsewhere, that was an untenable position, partly because it was hypocritical and partly because, sadly, there were serious human rights violations to deal with in the United States, initially around the prison system and the criminal justice system, but after 9/11, the whole 9 yards. I got hired to start George Soros's philanthropy in 1996 in the United States. He, too, had not seen the United States as a place to focus on initially. His early philanthropy was around China, South Africa, the former Soviet sphere. But he, too, came to feel first around issues of inequality and then around fundamental issues of democracy that the United States was a place that he needed to work. So I now I don't really define myself so much in those terms anymore as a person who kind of brings a focus on the United States to global institutions. I define myself in my philanthropic life through my job now at the Democracy Alliance as a professional redistributionist. So it's been my job to take rich people's money and help send it in various constructive ways. So to bring it up to the Democracy Alliance briefly, Democracy Alliance is an organization of donors, high net worth individuals who are politically active, but also 9 labor unions, a bank, a number of foundations, the dollars of working people and of wealthy people coming together to try to focus on building a more progressive system in the United States. And I would say for the Democracy Alliance donors and for progressive donors as a whole and for the progressive world as a whole, I'll say this one thing which echoes a bit of what Leah said, and that is the right has understood always, but particularly in the last 20 years or so, that it's about power And they have been extremely attentive to the structures of democracy and the rules of democracy to preserve their own power. We typically, all of us, typically have been more about issues and the policies that we care about, and those are very important. But it's dawning on people, I think, because of the success of the right, or has dawned on people, that if we don't pay attention to power and the structures, we are going to keep getting shut out, and we're going to lose our democracy. So Secretary Clinton gave a terrific account of the 4 factors that she talks to candidates about. I always thought of the 2016 election as like one of those Agatha Christie mysteries, where if you're trying to find out who did it, it ends up being everybody. You know, there's like 12 or 10 or 12 suspects. And one of my favorite ones, and it was alluded to by Michelle, is that in the 3 states that flipped to Trump, is no accident, particularly in Wisconsin, but also Michigan and Pennsylvania. There was a wave of anti-labor legislation that tried to gut labor's capacity to participate in civic engagement quite successfully. So if you look at the margins of those states and what the governors did in those states with forensic attention, that's one of the many good explanations for what happened in 2016. I'll come back to some of those themes later on.
Thank you so much, Guerra. Next, I'm turning it over to you, Amanda. And I know that you have seen firsthand in your interviews and being sent out on the road, but also sitting in corridors of power in DC, people doing the messy work of democracy, both legislators, but also individuals showing up, forming protest, or trying to lobby their government. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences over time and what you've seen, and perhaps some of the things we should have caught early on?
Sure. So I want to talk a little bit later about some of the threats to the industry that sort of go beyond Trump. I mean, I'm at HuffPost. Earlier this year, we laid off about 10% of our newsroom. And that was not unusual. That was happening at other digital outlets. It was happening at other legacy outlets, and it will continue to happen. But you know, I am a member of the media, but I fully understand the skepticism with the media. I got my start as a progressive blogger. After the Iraq War, I started at the progressive think tank, the Center for American Progress, and Think Progress, which shut down, unfortunately, just last week, I believe. And which is also a little bit depressing that a really strong progressive blog can't be sustained. And you know, we were skeptical of the mainstream media because we felt like it hadn't done its job on the Iraq War, and obviously it hadn't. But we responded to that by creating these other media institutions that we felt like could do a better job. If we talked about some facts or some research, we linked to it. We provided the documents so our readers could see it for themselves. We brought in people into the media conversation who wouldn't normally be allowed into the traditional publications. I did not come from a traditional journalism background. I probably wouldn't, I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I probably wouldn't have been able to afford to go to traditional journalism school. I grew up in a rural area in upstate New York. I didn't have access to a lot of media outlets. And you know, looking back, I feel like a lot of the media outlets really weren't speaking to people like me and to my experience. And I do feel like that for a while, the progressive blogosphere did bring, and not just the progressive blogosphere, you had other blogs too. You had conservative blogs, you had, you know, physics blogs, cat blogs. I mean, just like anything you wanted was out there, and you could find a community, and you could find different voices, and the cost of entry was pretty low. That's obviously changed over time, and it's not like those blogs are perfect. There are a lot of problematic communities within there as well. But you know, people went into the mainstream media. I'm now at HuffPost. Blogs folded. People went into politics, and you know, what we've seen now, and I think what has changed, is that people who are skeptical of the media, and again, some skepticism is good, now simply say, you know, it's all fake news. You know, who cares if it was in the New York Times? You can never believe what they say. And it's very, very easy to do that. And they've been given license to do that by the president, who has declared us the enemy of the people. At HuffPost, we were put very early on the blacklist, so we couldn't go to his campaign events. We went anyway. We just didn't register as press, which was fine because we could just walk around by ourselves and not be targeted. It was fine. It was great, actually. But it's not, putting a blacklist of the press just because the press writes things you don't like. The press is not supposed to write things that politicians like. My job is not to write stories that politicians like. I don't expect them to like my stories. That's fine. But if I write something that's accurate, if you put out, you just saw, you're seeing this with Jerry Falwell Jr. There are pictures out them of him at a club, and he's just saying, well, those are fake, those are photoshopped. And the photographer is saying, no, they're not. I took these pictures. But his supporters will continue to believe they're fake. And Trump has given license to people. And I don't think it's just his supporters. It's spreading across the country. In Oregon, there's a small paper called the Malheur Enterprise. And they've been investigating state lawmakers' business deals and contract work. And instead, the county is now investigating the newspaper because they say that they're harassing the government officials because they're doing things like contacting the government officials outside of work hours and writing to them on their personal email addresses. That is not harassment. How do you think this stuff happens? And that echoes what the Trump administration is doing. You had, I believe it was Donald Trump Jr., put up an email that David Fahrenthold from the Washington Post, an award-winning investigative reporter, he sent a very polite email to, I think, members of the Trump circle saying like, hey, just wanted to introduce myself. If you ever have anything that you want to send me, just want you to have my contact information, would love to hear from you. Donald Trump Jr. put this on Twitter like, look at the dirty tactics these people do in trying to get information from us. But this is how it works, and journalism is increasingly being criminalized. You saw in another case in San Francisco, police raided a reporter's house because he refused to turn over his confidential source, his source on a confidential police report he obtained, even though there are shield laws protecting journalists. Journalists are being detained and searched at the border, forced to hand over electronic information, and Reporters Without Borders has downgraded for the first time U.S. to problematic status in its press freedom. So, Trump, and I'm going to talk about this more later again, Trump is not the start of this, but he is giving license to people, even beyond his base and his party, to treat journalists like criminals.
Thank you, Amanda. Freaking me out a little, right?
I know.
And so next I would like to talk to Joy Reid. And Joy, you are one of the most visible people out there right now, carrying forward the message, bringing on interesting guests whose voices are not always heard in our democracy. And at the same time, you become a lightning rod, right? Because the other side looks at you, and most recently, Donald Trump was taking a close look at your work. So can you talk to us a little bit about the pressures of that, but also where you see that coming from, and if there were early things that really built into this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm not sure that Donald Trump wanted to admit that he was taking a look at my work, but he certainly did do an excellent promo for the show an hour before, so that was weird. So he's, we thank all of our new viewers at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. What I really want to focus on is I took a lot of notes during Secretary Clinton's talk, and I think it's important that we not gloss over the really key point that I think the Secretary made, which is that we in the United States are quite blasé about our democracy, and we have this presumption that our democracy is eternal. This is one of the youngest democracies on earth. I recently wrote a book. This is not a book promo, but this book that I wrote, I will name it because my publisher would be very angry if I didn't. It's called The Man Who Sold America. And I actually start with, comparing Donald Trump maybe to the Joker. But after that, because he is sort of a cartoonish almost villain, and we in some ways don't take him seriously enough because of sort of the sort of extremely kind of cartoonish nature of the things that they're doing. But after that, I kind of went into a very similar discussion about the ingredients that made 2016 possible. And you're right, it is one of those Agatha Christie mysteries where everybody did it, whether it was foreign interference, whether it was fake news and feeding it into particularly Black Americans' social media feeds to get particularly young African Americans not to vote or to vote third party, to discourage us. All of these ingredients went in, but I think we have to go way before Donald Trump to really think about why it is that was successful. And the notes I wrote down, start with the notion that the United States, while it is a democracy, was actually founded on a system that is fundamentally oligarchic, meaning that landed white Christian men had a special pride of place in terms of citizenship. And all of our history since the founding of this country has been about trying to preserve minority rule, that was essentially focused on the exceptional extra citizenship of landed Christian white men. And you see that all the way throughout, trying to prevent enslaved African Americans from even be seen as people or counted as people, but still needing their numbers in order to preserve the very wealthy planters' primacy in the Congress. They had to find a tricky way to count them, but not count them as people, trying to prevent their own wives and daughters from having the franchise because there's the fear that they might be too soft and might vote for expansions of things like labor. They might vote with the poor, trying to encourage non-landed, non-wealthy white men to be on the team, as W.B. Du Bois wrote, in offering them something other than money, because they certainly didn't want to offer them fair wages. They didn't want to offer them unionization, but they said, well, we'll offer you simply whiteness. We will just make your citizenship a plus up as well if you are a white Christian man, but you're not rich. So you're on the team because you're white, but you're not going to get anything. But we're going to make it seem like you're getting something extra because you can sit downstairs in the theater while the highest ranking black man has to sit upstairs, that kind of a thing. So I wrote a few notes during Secretary Clinton's speech that I think go to this. The first of it is that we have to recognize there have been 5 times, as you probably know, you guys seem like a very smart audience, that a candidate who's won the popular vote also lost the election. So Andrew Jackson, 1824, Samuel Tilden, 1876, who lost to Rutherford Hayes, Grover Cleveland to Benjamin Harrison in 1888, Al Gore in 2000, and Secretary Clinton in 2016. Since 1992, Democrats have actually won the popular vote in 5 out of the 6 elections. To repeat, since 1992, Democrats have won 5 out of 6, including the 2016 election. So, and they've also garnered 51.5% versus Republicans' 48.5% of the popular vote, meaning Democrats consistently are the majority and have been the majority, including in how people self-select and self-identify their party affiliation. So again, Republicans are the minority. We are already in minority rule. Second thing, I want to point out to you a thing called inversion. Inversion is actually that process by which the minority rules the majority. In 2016, Donald Trump lost by more than 3 million votes, by approximately 3 million votes to Secretary Clinton. George W. Bush lost by a mere 540,000 votes, but they still won because of the Electoral College. So there was a study by 3 economists at the University of economics researchers at the University of Texas that quantified basically how this works. And they wrote the following: in modern elections, where one party prevails by just 2 points in the 2-party popular vote, inversion is expected, meaning that the party that wins fewer votes gets the White House. They're expected in more than 30% of the elections. That number rises to 40% in elections with a 1% vote margin. Republicans, moreover, are far more likely to benefit from an inversion than Democrats. In the modern period, Republicans should be expected to win 65%. Republicans are expected mathematically to win 65% of presidential contests in which they narrowly lose the popular vote. Meaning that losing the popular vote is not only not a prevention to getting the White House for Republicans, the closer the election, the more likely it is that they win the election when they lose the popular vote. If you go back and you look at the 2008 and 2012 elections, President Obama's margins were 10 million the first time in 2008, and then 5 million in the re-elect. So you mean when you get to 5 million, then you go to 3 million, the likelihood becomes larger that the Republican can prevail. That's a pretty scary thing for democracy. The third thing is, of course, foreign interference. The Secretary talked about a couple of elections in which we know that there was interference, but we now know, thanks to the Senate Intelligence Committee, that all 50 election systems were targeted by Russia. And we now know that Donald Trump has more friends than just Vladimir Putin. He's also quite friendly with a lot of other governments: China, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, Israel, all sorts of countries that might have an interest in the outcome of the election and an interest in it coming out in his favor, regardless of what the majority of Americans want. Next thing, very quickly, demographic change. There has been a flip in the demographic fortunes of white America, such that in several states, the rate of death, meaning suicide, death from drug overdoses, et cetera, is exceeding the rate of births. Of the states where deaths now exceed births for white Americans, 13 of those voted for Donald Trump, and 13 of those voted for Hillary Clinton. 4 of them are states that flipped from President Obama in 2012 to Trump in 2016: Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida. Meaning that in states where white death rates are exceeding white birth rates, those states are starting to move toward the minority, toward the Republicans. Next, gerrymandering. There have been many studies that show, obviously, that gerrymandering is a system by which Republicans are protecting their power regardless of what the majority wants. But you had now the files of a gentleman named Thomas Hofeller, which were exposed to the country by his estranged daughter. On those files, he wrote a study in 2015 concluding that if a census question was added, a citizenship question was added to the census, it would enable Republicans to gerrymander and claim it's based on party, but he literally explicitly said it would enable them to prevent non-white people from gaining a majority, a power majority, that they could actually create a favorable condition for white people and Republicans by using the system in that way. So what I'll say is, to quickly wrap up, is that, you know, my parents are foreign, so I don't have this same sort of gauzy vision of either America's history or its possibilities. My father grew up in the Congo, which is also a system of minority rule based on tribe. And my mother came from a system in which the last president in her lifetime served for 24 years. No country is an eternal democracy. Democracy is extremely fragile, and multiracial democracy is so fragile, we're practically the only one that's pulled it off. My husband's from England. England has like 6% non-white people. This is a very difficult thing to maintain, and when you have a very determined minority, in this case, wealthy white men and wealthy white Christian men and Christian Americans who are of the fundamentalist variety, who are very clear that no matter what happens, if they have to pull the South Africa model to maintain power forever, they will do it. And they're not afraid of it, and they're increasingly open about it. And Donald Trump is merely the avatar for this. He didn't create it. He simply benefited from it. And I think the sooner that the majority, the actual numerical majority in this country, figures that out and stops treating these elections as just foregone conclusions, that you can fix it with just a simple election and that it will be fair, free and fair, the sooner that we will wake up and actually have majority rule in this country.
All right, thank you so much. I think that very clearly that this is sobering, perhaps even grim. I think we might have a little more grim to dig into. But at the same time, I think it's incredibly important for us to acknowledge that questioning the durability of democracy is our job right now, because we have to understand what has undermined the roots of it, and then figure out how we strengthen it, support it, scaffold it, and build it toward what a more modernized democracy looks like, where we have true representation of our citizenry for the government. So going forward, I want to start to pivot to some hope, just to keep everyone engaged and alive and hopeful. But to do that, I think, you know, you're also welcome to show where the vulnerabilities are and what we're trying to do. I can say from AFT's perspective, deeply concerned about election security, and I know later on today we're going to dig into that a little bit more. So I want to talk about really the need to engage citizens to vote, to participate, to show up, and to make sure that we have overwhelming results in 2020 so that we have the mandate to move forward the way we need to. We know that our members are registered, they vote at a higher rate than the general population. They also knock on doors, they make phone calls, they drag their households to vote, and they talk about it at work, which is really helpful. At the same time, AFT has worked with a number of our labor partners and Next Gen America to form the country's largest super PAC that is devoted to voter contact. And it's called For Our Future. It's in 7 critical states. You could probably guess what they are. And what it does is it works with the groups on the ground, the community groups that are already there, are already invested, and it works independently from candidate campaigns, but the real goal of it is to talk to low propensity voters and listen to low propensity voters and understand what's really happening in their lives. And so in doing this, I can tell you, because I've gone out on the doors with them a couple of times, and I remember being out there in 2000, being out there in 2004, and particularly in Pennsylvania in 2004, we'd be knocking on doors trying to make the case for a candidate. I'm trying to be very nonpartisan and not talk candidates, if you can guess. But hearing repeatedly on door after door, on people whose doors we were supposed to knock on, who were likely votes, people telling me there were no differences between the candidates, right? So, you know, fast forward a couple of years, obviously we had the Obama years, and then in 2016 we started on the doors, and we started things a little bit differently in showing up and asking people when they'd open their door, like, I mean, we wouldn't immediately jump into it and say like, hey, what's on your mind? But we would engage in conversations where we would ask people to start telling us what keeps them up at night, right? What are they really facing in their communities? And it would surface extraordinary answers, very locally based, but also sort of larger value based, that I think was not coming out in the polls. And one of the things about this that gives me hope is that when we start talking to people and really listening to them and hearing their views, it gives us a better sense on how we start addressing that, how we be really present and start working collectively on solutions, because most people do not believe solutions are coming from Washington, D.C. They believe it starts in their communities, the people they know and trust. This is partially problematic because there's been a systematic attack on government, so people have less faith. But it also gives us the grounding so they begin to see that we are there to partner with them and allow them to help lead where they need to. So with that, I'm going to start actually back over with Amanda, who I know doesn't necessarily have the same like signposts right now of bright lights, but I think it's really helpful to hear from you, thinking about some of the people you meet when you talk to them. What do you think are like the positive signs, and also what are the dispiriting signs that you've encountered as you've been out there talking to what I call civilians at this point?
I mean, you know, Leah obviously can talk a lot about this, but you've seen people in the last couple years get so involved. Many people we've talked to say that they were never politically active at all, and suddenly they are now. And I'd be interested to hear more from Leah too about how sustained that's been, because I've heard some people worried that, you know, after the big burst after 2016 and 2018, people were worried that, you know, it's a lot of work. They have their lives to get back to, and whether that energy can be sustained going forward. And I understand that there will be ebbs and flows in an election season. But you know, it's not just electorally. You have the Sunrise Movement. We had one of our reporters the other day was on Capitol Hill following around a group of activists who came to DC to confront Democratic senators who had voted to confirm some Trump judges. And just more and more you're seeing that people feel like activism can make a difference. And obviously it's not the first time that activism has done this, but people feel this renewed sense of energy. And I think it's important that they're out there doing it, that the media covers it, and that, you know, they are having to think up new ways to keep people's attention, whether it's getting politicians, you know, at the airport, or whether it's doing these big protests on the Hill. So I think, you know, that's encouraging. You're also seeing, I just think more people sort of understand that, you know, the ways that they can, you know, use social media to be out there, use the media and talk to media, get attention. Again, obviously some probably politicians and maybe media organizations don't like this, but you know, from my perspective too, the other thing that's encouraging is despite all the layoffs, all the attacks on the media, right now I have a job opening for a political reporter, and I am getting flooded with really talented, qualified candidates, many of them young people out of college, many people, you know, who are already established, but there are so many talented journalists out there who want to go into this field, no matter how dire it is, no matter you know, how low the pay is, the fact that you're probably going to be laid off at some point in your career, they still want to do it, and they're doing great work, and so that's been very heartening to see as well.
That's great, thank you. And Leah, I'm going to ask you to build on that and talk a little bit about sort of how you've seen people embrace the Indivisible Guide and what that has been built into.
Absolutely. And I would start by just saying I think one of the first and most important things is that we're all just a lot more honest about what's at stake right now, that we're having conversations like this that really are drawing the connections between historical trends, between our political system, between rising white nationalism, between all of the different, rising corporate power, all the different factors that are combining to actually create Is this better? Okay. That are combining right now, but that are certainly not reflections of Trump as an aberration, but they're reflections of broader forces. And I think, just from my perspective as somebody who has been working very closely with many folks who became politically active after 2016, there's a really common emotional core for folks who went from 0 to 60 at that point, and it's this sense that whatever about our political system was supposed to stop an outcome like this that was so wildly unacceptable, whatever that was failed. And with that comes a whole set of questions about what are the rules of the game, how did we get here, what are the ways in which our political system has been structured to lock people out, to suppress voices, to undermine the actual representation. And with that has come a really sustained focus on activism dedicated to the rules of the game, right? So on voting rights, on gerrymandering, on judicial nominations, on all the kinds of forces that are actually shaping and focusing on power, which is not necessarily the first place that folks go in their motivation, right? Not that many people kind of like woke up originally most focused on gerrymandering, but they are now focused on it as the way that they are able to, the thing that is blocking change. And in terms of sort of the overall trends around activism, what we've seen and what seems to be confirmed by a lot of the folks like Theda Scotchpole, who's been studying pop-up grassroots activists, is really not the kind of drop-off that people expected in 2017. I remember in March 2017, people were like, okay, yeah, they marched, but like, is that gonna turn into, are they gonna keep doing it? And then, okay, sure, they went to town halls, but is that gonna turn into electoral results? And then it was like, okay, well, sure, it worked in Virginia, but is it gonna, can we keep it going? And what we've seen is actually this is really sustained. It's people digging in. It's often very close, very powered by building bonds and ties at a local community level, and kind of trying to create a grassroots volunteer civic infrastructure of people who keep each other going through the hard times and who focus on Trump, but also on their local city council race and everything in between. And just from our own perspective, we actually had our single largest national week of action in the last week, which was just focused on the upcoming budget fight and on funding for the Department of Homeland Security and ICE and CBP in particular, because one of the things that we see as very tightly related to the current crisis of democracy is the way that Trump is targeting immigrants, the way that he is turning the weapon or the enforcement and agencies into implementers of his agenda. And we think that that's an important part of a resistance to Trump, again, a resistance not just to Trump, but to the forces that have allowed him to rise. And from our own perspective, we are sort of in the process of orienting around, as we are obviously a resistance organization, but we obviously started in this resistance moment, but we are focusing not just on getting Trump out of office, but on an inclusive democracy that comes after him. And we say inclusive democracy we think that's really important because we think we need to recognize that so much of the fight right now is very much about the struggle between a white minority corporate rule and the struggle for a genuine multiracial inclusive democracy. And we are seeing a lot of enthusiasm at the grassroots level for embracing that frame and for recognizing that the finish line is not getting Donald Trump out of office, it's structural reforms that actually change the way that democracy works.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I would say, as you describe the work, it's very clearly a golden age for civics teachers around the country, only because it's giving fresh examples. I don't think it's necessarily the thing they were hoping would unfold. And we certainly need more civics teachers right now in more schools and classrooms because it's critically important that as our kids are witnessing this, that they are given context and understand how to use it. In our schools, we are seeing upticks both in student activism, but also troublingly bullying. And so we're trying to figure out what is the best way to give kids supports and skills so they're addressing that. And so Joy, as someone who has obviously experienced online bullying and really discourteous behavior. I'm hoping that at the same time you are also feeling the forces of support and people saying keep going and people pointing out like the extraordinary work that you do every day. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you're hearing from people who are inspired by seeing you and hearing your voice?
Yeah, absolutely. So #BeBest. Sorry. No shade. I would just say that, absolutely there's a lot that's toxic about social media, but I definitely, whether it's just real humans on the street or people on social media or people who, comment in my Instagram, yes, I mean, the overwhelming majority, again, you can become, Twitter can warp your sense of what is real, right, in a fundamental way, because it's partly based on who you decide to follow and who follows you, much the way that Facebook sort of changed the meaning of friend. Like, there are people that I know on social media that I've never actually met, but we're actually friends. Like, everything has sort of been altered by social media. But one of the things that I would say is even as many, for every, sort of insane Nazi that attacks me with a face, with the Hitler face or the little green frog face, there are 1,000 people who are just supportive and really great. So, I just believe personally, because I'm a geek, that everything can be boiled down to essentially Lord of the Rings, right? So it really explains the world. If you watch it, all the trilogy, you will see that I am right. And then essentially, Lord of the Rings works because Frodo and the elves and the wizards and the dwarves and all of them from all these different worlds have to agree that they have to get the ring to Mordor, right? Like, that they all have this one goal that this little guy has to convince them is the only goal. And I'm finally starting to see, whether it's in online activism or genuine activism, the kind of things that Indivisible or Color of Change and all these other groups are doing, is that people are finally making the connections, right? That you have to connect the defunding of public schools to gerrymandering, that it all fits in together, that, trying to kill unions, which has been a long-term project in places like Wisconsin, is connected to trying to deprive people of the vote. That attacking teachers is actually not disconnected to attacking unionized workers in the auto field. Like, it's all connected, and that you have to actually think through having control of the Senate in addition to having a Supreme Court that isn't going to lock in far-right corporate rule for 20 or 30 years. Like, people are starting to see the full picture. They're starting to know what Mordor is. And they're starting to realize that we all, from all of our different sections of the community, do have to pull together. Because if you add up, the elves and the wizards and the hobbits and the, and the men, that all together they are the majority and that they can win. So I actually am hopeful that people finally get it. It's been a long time trying to get particularly Americans on the left to do that, because people who are liberal, just maybe it's something constitutionally, small c constitutionally, tend to really react to emotion, to emotional need rather than to the idea of power, and in some cases are a bit reluctant about power, feel a bit uncomfortable with the idea of power. They're more about caring about people and not connecting that the only way that you're concerned for people can actually have life and can actually help people is if you have power. And I think you're finally starting to see a greater comfort with the idea of having power. I taught a class at Syracuse University that started the week after the election, and after the 2016 election. And my class was 19 students, my first class, 16 of whom were young white women. And the first class was a group of just devastated people, none of whom had been really that hyped about the election, because they had just assumed that they were going to have the first woman president. They were just already, it was set in their mind. They believed the data, they just assumed it was going to happen, so they were quite casual about it. And there are demographers who are looking now that they call it the lazy Democratic voter, because they just presumed everything was going to be okay. They didn't really worry about it. And then they panicked the day after. And what's the upside, to give you the hope message, the upside of that panic is that this has been a sustained panic. Democratic voters are, and I mean Democratic voters, capital D and small d, people who actually believe we should be a democracy, are panicked now. And they were panicked in 2018, such that was the largest mid-year election turnout since 1974. There had not been that long. I mean, typically, Democratic voters fall off every 2 years. That's why 2010 was a disaster for Democrats, particularly for African Americans, a disaster. Why finally the Republican takeover of the South kicked in 2014. People think it happened in '68. The Republicans didn't get control of the entire South till 2014 when they got North Carolina. Because Democratic votes go way up in Michigan, huge turnout, they drop down 2 years later, and then all of a sudden you have a huge water crisis in Flint because they allow Republicans to take over 2 years after running out to vote for President Obama. That kind of lazy voting, and I don't mean it as a pejorative, but that lazy voting in 2018, that was like, we're not gonna be lazy anymore. People are panicked. The loss in 2016 really made it very clear. If a candidate can win by 3 million votes and not be president, we have a problem. And this isn't even from people, and I hear this from friends of mine who are Republicans who voted third party, voted for Gary Johnson, because they too were lazy voters. They were like, I don't want to vote for Secretary Clinton because I'm a Republican, but I don't want to vote for Donald Trump because he's in their minds insane, and so they didn't want to vote for him. He's like, he's not qualified, but they casually voted third party. I think the casual nature of people's concern about democracy is over. And the good news is that people finally figured that out.
That's great. Thank you. And Guerra, as someone who I would possibly describe as a human Tinder between the donor community and key institutions that we really need strengthened right now. Talk to us a little bit about changes you've seen, investments you've seen, and where there's real growth and hope.
Okay.
You should get a shirt that says you're Tinder.
Yeah. I've been watching the Democratic presidential debate, so I'm going to be very good at pivoting to what I actually want to talk about. Which I have something to say about record players. No. I want to do, I'll answer your question, but in the course of saying, as I'm sitting here thinking and listening to my colleagues, I do think that grim as the possible erosion or elimination of American democracy is, there are really at least 4 things that are very hopeful. I mean, one is, and it's been said in other ways before, but if everybody votes, we win. We are the majority. So that's about mobilizing people to turn out. I think you've seen on the part of all kinds of organizing networks and people's organizations and groups, from the Restaurant Opportunity Center to the National Domestic Workers and so on. All these folks are upping their civic engagement game. And if we can address all the factors that Secretary Clinton and others have talked about, which are very serious, about suppression, about the kind of various aspects which could lead to a kind of an American apartheid. If we vote, we win. And that's the good news, very bit of good news. I would also say that, and again, Joy touched on this and a few others have, it's important, I think we're more and more having a reckoning with our own, we're more and more having a reckoning, it's not going to be an echo, right? More and more having a reckoning with our own past, right? So there's no need. I think it's very important in talking about, in defense of American democracy, not to be starry-eyed about the past. We're not trying to restore some perfect democracy. We are trying to perfect a democracy that has been there have been efforts to improve it since the very beginning, and thank God the Constitution itself contains the tools and the mechanisms for protecting it. And its protections have expanded steadily over the years through struggle. But when you look at the 1619 Project, when you look at the attention that's coming right now to Reconstruction again, with Skip Gates's book and Eric Foner's book and all kinds of things, the reckoning that a lot of people are doing with the nature of American democracy since the beginning, the notion that slavery was not just something you fought the Civil War over, but was actually is baked into every institution of American life, that reckoning cannot but be good, for the democratic project we're talking about here. Third, and I kind of echoing what Leah and others have said, this is the most vibrant time over the last 5-6 years, certainly, for social movements in the United States probably in my lifetime. With Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Dreamers, the Red for Ed, all the kinds of people taking, well before what is typically called the resistance, with the Women's March and all that. That is being sustained, in my view. It's very hopeful. Democracy is not just what happens at the polls. Democracy is not just an event. It's an effort to hold leaders accountable after elections. And from where I sit, and you asked about the work I do with these donors, Democracy Alliance has moved substantially toward understanding that elections are not episodic, that elections are, that you need to support people who are in communities, you need to support those who have been marginalized, colonized, oppressed, taking up their place in the society. And I think the growing recognition of that and the growing power of that is also extremely hopeful. And the final thing I want to say is that, and again, this conference today and Randy and Secretary Clinton's kind of understanding of this, that put this together, is democracy itself is increasingly becoming the issue. So I've been involved in, democracy reform stuff for years, and typically it was divided in a way into two camps, which were kind of somewhat racially organized. There were the kind of wonky white campaign finance reform people or rules type people who were looked at as a technical thing. And there were kind of the voting rights community, the people who dealt with the Voting Rights Act and voter suppression and voter ID laws and so on. And this is not perfect by any means, but there's a growing understanding of a larger concern about the democracy that kind of trumps any particular issue. And I see that not only in the holding of conferences like these, but in the discourse in the presidential election, right? So for the first time, in my memory anyway, in a kind of a frontal way, you have various candidates, Elizabeth Warren is one, Buttigieg is another one, and there are others, talking not just about what they're going to do about climate change or what they're going to do, but having to talk about how do they plan to do that in a Senate with a filibuster rule? How do they plan to do that in a Supreme Court that is kind of heading back toward the Lochner era of being the body that will then kind of invalidate all progressive legislation? You see it happening with preemption and things like that in all kinds of states which have progressive cities and increasingly progressive governments that are vetoed by the courts. And so the widening of this conversation to questions like the composition of the Electoral College, which from the very beginning has been skewed, towards small states and against the majority of the people, the composition of the Senate, the rules of the Senate, those are issues that are being debated more in the most important forums that we have. And also, finally, it's coming to be understood among a wide range of organizations and movements that democracy is everybody's issue. So there is, for instance, something called the State Democracy Project, which we are urging our donors to support, which is a coalition of kind of unlikely suspects, groups like Demos and the NAACP and environmental groups and Planned Parenthood, all of them who have not typically been focused on these structural issues of democracy, but understand that if they don't pay attention to those structural issues and put those front and center, they're not going to accomplish anything. And so I view it as extremely hopeful that you not only have this wider recognition of attention to our past and to the structural issues of the moment, but that organizations across a spectrum of movements are coming to understand that this is something that has to be front and center for them.
And can I just add one thing quickly? That I'm sorry, I'm loud. I may not need that. That's exactly right. And if you look at organizations like the Parkland Kids, my kids were raised in Florida, not far from Parkland, and those young people, I keep calling them kids because to me they're still children. They are extraordinary. They are amazing. They deserve. They have the John Lewis ethos, right? So John Lewis was the kid who, Dr. King had to say, whoa there, you're a little strong there, you need to calm down a little bit, because he was the Black Lives Matter guy. He was like these kids. They're intersectional, they're smart, but the most important thing is they're not afraid. They're too young to remember the time when they were supposed to be afraid of Marion Hammer and the NRA. They don't remember that, and so they're not afraid of her. They're not afraid of the NRA. They don't care. They hold the super majority position on gun reform. The vast majority, 8 out of 10, even most gun owners. I grew up in Colorado. Everybody had a gun, but nobody would ever think of taking it to to the store. Like, we would never saw all our friends' fathers had guns. We never saw them. They would never think to show it to anyone or to walk around with it just to sort of compensate for whatever issues they're having inside of them. Like, that would never happen. But these young people aren't scared of this lobby, and the lobby is weakening. As you can see, financially, they only put $8 million in 2018, which is versus in 2016, they put like $26 million in toward trying to elect Donald Trump. And then for the first time, and this is not an endorsement, but you have people like Beto O'Rourke who actually are cussing openly about gun reform and saying this fear of even talking about reforming things that we already had. The Tommy gun, you can't have a Tommy gun. That was gun reform. It was illegal. It's been made illegal. It's not as if this is some revolutionary thing. You know, you want to talk about Joe Biden, he signed the bill that a lot of black folk don't like now and that are very unhappy about, but it did have an assault weapons ban in it. We've banned lots of kinds of guns. That's happened before. And so the institutional memory that's held us back, I think, is one of the key things that's eroding, that's allowing younger people and even not so younger people to stand up for what the majority of Americans want.
And one thing we also didn't, can you hear me or do I need that?
Dang, I'm the loudest.
Another thing that we didn't really touch on was the number of people running for office now, and the fact that a lot of them are different than people who ran for office in the past. And you're talking about sort of lobbyist groups with a lot of money. We're seeing candidates now who don't need to rely on that money because they're getting money from people around the country who are donating to them. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has said, like, she doesn't need to spend her time fundraising, so she can spend her time meeting with people, getting ready for hearings, because she's not having to go to these high-dollar fundraisers, meet with these big interest groups. She's getting online donations from people who support her work. You're seeing Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders also skipping those fundraisers and getting donations from individuals. And if people want to see less influence from these big groups, they need to get involved in the process, donate small amounts of money. And again, the system, money in politics, is really screwed up, and it should not be like it is, and not every candidate can do that. But that is a way to try to counter some of the influence of these bigger groups.
Technology fails. And yes, thank you for that. AFT itself generated 300 candidates among our members who were running for everything from one governor of Michigan, down to the most local of races. And that makes me want to take a moment and start to talk about states, cities, towns, and even rural areas. We've sort of alluded to it in your remarks, but I'd like to take a minute and just overtly talk about what's happening on the ground, be it Generation Z showing up, fighting for things they want in their communities, really meeting local officials, but then also just thinking of states as the labs of innovation. Where are bright lights out there, and where do we see democracy progressing forward? And I throw that open to anyone.
Well, if you look at gun reform specifically, there's a lot more happening than you would know from looking at the federal issues. In states like Colorado, governors and state legislatures, particularly when they're democratically controlled, uppercase D, democratically controlled, are taking it upon themselves to overrule the gun industry. You're even seeing corporate America, which, the Anand Giridharadas narrative of corporate America, I fundamentally agree with it. Sometimes they try to sort of clean up kind of issues with corporate governance with charity, and sometimes the sort of very rich do too. But in the case of gun reform, Walmart and NASCAR are actually leading the charge to make it unacceptable to publicly show off your weapons, to intimidate and scare other people. NASCAR actually refused ads for the AR-15, which is the gun of choice of mass shooters. You're starting to see the public coalesce around using public opprobrium to kind of get the same results. And on the local level, you're seeing that happen. The second thing I would say is on district attorney. People are starting to finally realize that that the district attorney you elect really matters in terms of Black Lives Matter. If you have somebody who's willing to at least try to prosecute police who kill people without a good reason to kill them in the course of ordinary traffic stops, that really matters. And people are starting to think through not just clicking for the D, because Sheriff Clark ran as a Democrat. And he got in over and over and over again because he was the Democrat. The same thing happened in Ohio, where Tamir Rice was killed. The same things happened all over the country, where the DA is actually a Democrat, and where people are starting to think, let me think through who I'm voting in as a judge. Or, in Chicago, that election turned over, the DA's election turned over, because people said, wait a minute, this isn't good enough to just have any generic Democrat. Within the primary process, you're starting to see people think about, who is this DA? Who are these elected judges? So there's a lot that's going on below the surface that's actually making progressive change.
Yeah, and I would love to lift up Color of Change, which has been doing
Yes.
extraordinary work on educating about the DA's role, the
Yep.
AG's role, and turning people out in
Yeah.
these races.
And Marilyn Mosby, let's give her a huge
absolutely.
lift up, because there are not a lot of DAs who would risk prosecuting police for abusing and even killing people, because immediately the other side comes for you and tries to take your job. And so I want to give her a boost as well.
So I have a slightly more pessimistic take in terms of the media and what's going on at the state and local level. I have a statistic here from 1970 to 2016. The American Society of News Editors found that about 500 daily newspapers went out of business. And that's, as I said, in last year, 2017 to 2018, about a third of the nation's largest newspapers reported layoffs. So did about a quarter of digital sites, including HuffPost. Another study found that between 1996 and 2005, 204 counties were left with 2 or fewer daily newspapers. And I think that this was happening. Obviously, most of the numbers I named happened before Trump ever came into office. This predates him. And I think you need to look back into the mid-20th century when a lot of independent, smaller, family-owned newspapers started merging, started being bought up by conglomerates. And this consolidation, as it is in many industries, was really bad for the media industry. And these companies were not interested in innovation. They were interested in making sure their shareholders made a profit. And that, a lot of people like to blame the internet and Huffington Post and other digital sites for killing journalism, which I think, from my perspective, is stupid and short-sighted and is sort of just, I have a lot of thoughts on that. But, you look back further, why did these newspapers and these conglomerates have to lay people off to cut costs and be lean? Because they borrowed a lot of money and they were interested in making profit. News is a business, and these companies are interested in making money. And so they failed to adapt to the internet. And all of these other problems that they blame for later are rooted back in their business model. And so localities and states have lost newspapers, and this has real consequences. There have been studies that have found that when local newspapers disappear, city costs increase. Why? Because no one's there looking at the business deals and the corruption, and so it's allowed to flourish. And so I think that there is a lot of great work going on at the state level in terms of politics, but there's also a lot more corruption and a lot more bad actors that are going unnoticed because there aren't local papers there to deal with them. And I love the New York Times and the Washington Post just as much as anyone else, but just saying that you're a subscriber to them and they're thriving and therefore journalism is doing well, they're not representative of most media outlets out there, especially these lower level outlets in terms of where they're located, and progressive outlets. A lot of progressives, again, like to say how they subscribe to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Do you subscribe? Are you a member of progressive outlets? Are you a donor who is funding progressive media outlets and making sure there's a progressive media infrastructure there, even when it's inconvenient? I get so many emails from readers saying, like, why are you criticizing Democrats? We all have to come together to beat Trump. That's not actually my job. And I think that as progressives, you have to support the media, even when it's maybe criticizing your candidate. It's not saying what you want. You have to support that a strong media is good for democracy.
Well, since I'm holding the mic, I think what Amanda says is extremely important, because it's important to see democracy as an ecosystem in which, yes, voting is a part, and systems of government, and all the things we're mainly talking about. But if you leave out of that equation an informed, if you will, an informed citizenry, you're missing a big part of it. And the trends there have been, as she points out, alarming. I've worked for progressive donors for 20 years or more, and I've been, one of my biggest frustrations is the general disinclination of progressive donors, to invest in media. Soros was never interested in it in the United States, and others are, and that has been at our, to our great cost. I mean, one word that hasn't come up too much here, interestingly enough, is this word that is trending in the last couple of years of norms. So we've been talking about democratic processes and democratic structures and democratic systems, but we also are experiencing, on the one hand, an erosion of democratic norms that will be hard to repair. That we've all learned, let me put it this way, more than we had probably been aware, most of us, of just how much of what we consider to be the system is embodied in kind of informal understandings and so-called norms, as opposed to formal processes. And I think Trump's constant lies in what we have, and I look at myself as an example, it's hard not to become somewhat numbed. It is hard not, normalcy is changing, and it gets harder and harder to remember. And I think that just as all these trends of assaults on democracies predated Trump for a long time, certainly in the way the Republican Party has behaved, in the complicity of the Republican Party in this all over the United States, it's also true that some of this is going to outlast Trump and could even be used by others who are even more capable than Trump is. On the other hand, I think maybe norms are changing in a positive way. Let me put a more positive spin on it. I think the norm of participation, the norm of involvement, for many people, that has really risen. And if that can become more inculcated as a norm of what active citizenship is about, we'll be a much better country.
I think a lot of great stuff has already been covered, so I'll just lift up the intersection between local activism and the importance of local news. One of the major challenges that we see folks face around the country is so much of the way that we focus on accountability, so much of the way that we focus on changing the narrative in your own community is about, can you get local news coverage? And that is a hugely difficult thing to do if everything is owned by Sinclair Broadcasting. And that is going to be a challenge that we are facing and that will likely just continue to get harder over time.
Great, thank you. And Guerra, as to norms, I would say it is exhausting living in the city and working on this. Frequently, everyone I meet looks like they need a nap and a vegetable at this point. I want to say one last word on states, which is sometimes civic participation moves from the other direction. And there is a wonderful organization, the State Innovation Exchange, disclosure, I'm on the board, but it actually does the thing that our progressive legislators desperately need out there, right? It provides the infrastructure, it works with them to help connect them to the ground in different issue campaigns so that they have the materials they need, because our state legislators don't necessarily have the staff and the resources we might imagine when we want them to go out there and do battle on the issues we care about. So I want to open this up for questions right now and give you all a chance to ask your questions. I think there will be mics provided. Can I have someone raise their hand who has the mics out there? Terrific. And while we are waiting for you to line up and ask your questions, I will kill time by asking each of you, this is a lightning round where I want each of you to give a quick piece of advice or guidance on what you're reading, what you're binge watching, what you're listening to that's like fueling you going forward right now.
Oh my
I don't know if this is not super helpful, but I just started the new book on Uber and its rise and collapse, and I think it's a pretty fascinating window into a whole set of currents around the way that we've been thinking about innovation, the way that we've been thinking about who gets left behind with new innovation, and the use of new actors to sort of squelch competition.
Well, I always have a novel and a nonfiction thing going. And the nonfiction thing that I'm reading right now, I referred to briefly before, which is Gilles Lepore's book called These Truths, I think it is, her history of the United States, which I really highly recommend. I'm going to butcher this name, but I was on leave this summer. I got a little off social media and even the newspaper. When I came back, there was a piece by Jamie Ponezuik, I don't know, the television critic of the New York Times, who apparently has a new book about Trump and TV, and his, I think it was in the Week in Review, was Trump as a character on television. And I thought understanding Trump through the lens of being an actor, kind of playing a version of himself via reality TV, was really insightful and one of the better things I've read in a long time.
So the book I just bought that I'm excited to start is She Said, obviously about taking down Harvey Weinstein. And then I'm also rewatching The X-Files, which holds up really well and still seems really relevant today.
Well, I watch a lot of Netflix for my downtime. I want to pick up my sister, June Carroll, who's in Mindhunter. If you watch season 2, she's in it, and she's really good. I watch a lot of zombie stuff. I watch all the Walking Dead series. Gotta love that. Unfortunately, I watch Years and Years, which is kind of like a documentary. The book that I would highly recommend people read, it isn't new, it was mentioned before, is How Democracies Die. Not a beach read, but I think important for people to read it and take it in.
Michelle?
Okay, the right answer is Fleabag, but I'm glad to see people are also like enriching themselves while they are learning and also relaxing a little bit. And Randy would kill me. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention On Tyranny by Tim Snyder.
Oh, yeah,
not as fun as Fleabag. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to the audience now. Dan?
Okay. Hi, good evening. I'm Elizabeth Davis, president of the Washington Teachers Union. Thank you. And so my question is not about voter rights suppression, it's about education, because I am an educator of 44 years. And I think that as a teacher in the District of Columbia, teaching at one of the Brown v. Board schools, which basically taught me more lessons about the case, how one of the schools in DC participated, was one of the cases involved there. But looking at Brown 60 plus years later, the spiraling back to triple segregation is what I'm calling it now. My question in regards to privatization of the public education system, how the public schools are being underfunded by the Trump-DeVos administration, what role do you see privatization playing in basically undermining democracy? And if you see it as playing a role, what would that be? What does it look like? When I think of the programs, this public school system here in the district, which is now 50% charters, DC voucher program, which is basically diverting public funds to private schools, I see a lot of poor black and brown families whose civil and human rights are being violated as a result of the privatization of our school system. So I just want to get your thoughts on whether or not this is a national agenda, and if it has an impact on our democratic society.
Can I jump in on? I'm not an educator, but my mother was a college professor, was a teacher. So teachers, number one, teachers and librarians, like number 1 and 2, most important people. And I'll just say that I'm glad that you brought that up, because if you think about privatization, it isn't a Trump administration Betsy DeVos thing. Post Brown versus the Board of Education, the far right's focus that now appears to be all about abortion was initially not about abortion. It was about subsequent to Brown v. Board Supreme Court rulings that then said, as white parents fled the public school system throughout the South and parts of the North, that if there were going to be integrated public schools, they didn't want their kids in them. And so once they fled to these private schools, they were still able to take a tax deduction on that tuition until the Supreme Court said, no, you can't. And there were 2 Supreme Court rulings that said you can't actually take that tax deduction. That actually was the foundation that formed the far right's push to control the Supreme Court. The anti-abortion part of it kicked in as a reparative to the bad optics of saying we want to protect our right to send our children to all-white schools. There's a great article in Slate, which I'll send to you guys after, hopefully you can share it, that really lays this out, that religious right was really focused much more on private religious all-white schools than they were on abortion initially. Abortion kicked in later because it was better sell. And that's now become the sort of obsession of the far right for the courts. But at the end of the day, please pay attention to what the Supreme Court does on schools, on things like affirmative action, and on trying to essentially lay into the law the idea that segregation, that resegregation, which we've seen, as you've said, we've got segregation 3 times over. Because essentially now, what parents who don't want their children in segregated public schools do is they do 2 things: pull their kids out, put them in private school, but then as a polity, they become opposed to the funding in the states of public schools. If you look at North Carolina, which is ground zero for this, they fight, the Republicans there fight like hell not to fund public schools. Mississippi, which has probably the lowest rated public schools in the country. Florida, where I used to live, where it's a battle to get a penny for public schools. It's because wealthy, particularly white Christian, wealthy folks, their kids aren't in the schools. So if you go to places like Selma, where you had this incredible movement toward integration, the schools, the Little Rock, Arkansas high school that was desegregated in '57 is now almost all black. So those formerly integrated schools, and this is not just in the South, it's also in the North, it's also in New York. And it's here, it's everywhere. And so we need to realize that the resegregation of our public schools is just a part of it. We were talking before, it's all one big Rubik's Cube. It's all one thing, and that trying to create excess citizenship for some people and deprive others, it's all together. Because once you pull the money out of public schools, you're also pulling the money out of allowing black kids to emerge into the middle class. You also have an increased presence of police in those public schools, where you can now take those children and transit them directly into prisons, which are also very profitable. You can also stop language education that allows Latino kids whose parents are immigrants to fully integrate into the school. You start to degrade all of this. Girls being able to have fully funded athletic programs. You start to take away art, you take away music. This is all systematic, because then what you create is a batch of citizens who are living in the second class, even if the law says they are first-class citizens. And I think we need to think about that, because as goes the segregation of public schools, so goes the segregation of neighborhoods, even unions, jobs, and government power. So yeah, I think there needs to be a focus by the Democrats. We even had 1 question on education in any of these debates. There have been 3 debates. Nobody's mentioned this at all. And so I think there needs to be a wake up, and the way that you get at it, and this is for our friend who talks to people with money, Republicans, unlike Democrats, they go in that school board. They spent $1 million. I grew up in Colorado. They spent about $1 million to take over this one school system in Colorado, in Colorado Springs, which is a more wealthy area not far from where I grew up. And they spent all that money, and you're like, why would they spend all that money on the school board? Why did they spend all that money on local elections and school board elections in places like Texas and Wisconsin? Because they're feeding people up from the school board up. They're in Texas taking over the textbooks because Texas is so big, that can feed into the textbooks all over the country to rewrite American history in favor of the wealthy and in favor of white Christian men. So I think we need to think about this holistically, and the public schools are the canary in the coal mine for what's happening in this country.
Control.
Yep.
A school board race funded candidates running with money coming from outside of the
Correct.
district, heavy money.
And I would love to ask our friend here is, are liberal-leaning donors or more progressive donors who represent the majority opinion, thinking about funding at that local level, or is all the money, particularly for African Americans, we've been so president fixated because normally the cavalry was the federal government. And so we fixate on the president, right? And a lot of liberals do too, they fixate on the president. But the person who puts your kid in school is the local sheriff and the local judge, and the people who are depriving your children or can't give them an education, they don't even have books, are the public school, and the school boards control how your school operates. So I wonder if some of that funding is actually getting down to those local school board races, because the money would actually be more productive there.
Well, Joy gave a master class as an answer to that question. I had the mic in my hand and various things I mentally ticked off that I didn't need to say anymore. But since you pivoted a little bit, I was going to say just 2 things. One is that just as Amanda kind of reminded us that this ecosystem of democracy is not just voting and all the things we're talking about, but the media, I would say the third leg of that stool clearly is education. And there's been an assault. I mean, Joy's exactly right. I think that you could make a strong argument that the beginning of the rise of the right electorally was in these school board. I saw it when I was running the ACLU in Texas in 1984 and in 1988, and the way people would run these local school boards and all the problems that would come as a result of that, and those people then went on to do other things. And so And I think if you look at the policies of this administration, from DeVos on down, both higher education and K-12 education, they're really designed to cut away at an informed and active citizenry. I mean, I guess I would say that donors are, most donors, live in states, they live someplace. They're not all, while they are disproportionately focused on the presidency and national races, we have tried very much to push that downward over the years. The DA's races is one thing. There's an enormous amount of activity on the part of progressive donors around the country, understanding that those are pivotal to the criminal justice system and everything else. Somewhat less so in my direct experience with school board stuff, but I would say in general, as is often the case, the left has kind of belatedly realized that the right's attention to these local offices is something they have to play catch up on. I will say one other uncomfortable thing, however, is that Democrats are not, in this whole debate about privatization in schools, are not blameless. And so there's a significant strain in the Democratic Party for privatization and all those kinds of things, and that is, it is one of those issues in which we probably don't have enough of, debates among progressives about that, and it's one of the, I'll just leave it there.
And I'm going to turn it back to questions.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Burris, and I'm a senior policy associate at the Century Foundation. We're a think tank that seeks to reduce inequality, and our research is focusing on socioeconomically and racially integrating schools. To add on to the first question, I would like to know what hope do you have for civics education in terms of curriculum and pedagogy in promoting racially and socioeconomically integrated schools?
I know I spoke last, but I thought I would be provocative. I hear people talk about civics education, and I know it's been on the decline, and I think that it definitely, we need to do better at using the schools to educate people about the systems of democracy. I think, however, that has to go hand in hand with rights and democracy within school settings for students, right? Because a student who's in a school where they have to go through a metal detector and also is going to learn whatever lesson about civics you want them to learn more from the way the school is structured and the way they're treated than from anything they're learning in civics class. So it's not I'm not against civics education. I just think that it has to be part and parcel of in the trend about what I would say about students' rights and democratization and rights in schools is going in the wrong direction, mostly.
And if I could add that, if anybody got a chance to read the 1619 project that was done in the New York Times, which is a revolutionary project, they're actually creating a curriculum to use in public schools around the country, which hopefully people will pick up. But, to say an uncomfortable thing, to do my own little Beto right for a moment, Democrats have been very reluctant and very shy, and the Obama administration tried to make some moves in this direction of talking about a national curriculum. We have 130 different, little curricula, and the curriculum, some say that, Jesus rode a dinosaur, and they can do that because they don't have science education that has to have some imprimatur of reality that comes from a trusted source. Now, the caveat to that is that you're not always going to be able to trust the government. I mean, right now, it's hard to trust the data coming out of Washington because this administration has been, so thoroughly corrupted government itself that it's not clear when you see the numbers that you can believe them, or they're not being spun or being put out for political purposes. But in theory, a healthy nation should have one history. And right now, this nation has any history that the school board wants it to have. And so the problem is not just that the history isn't appeasing Black folks by telling the truth about our history, it's actually harming majority children too. Because the myths about America make it a lot easier to sell people against democracy, to say that in order to preserve this mythical pretend America, you need to be willing to give up democracy and instead have more and more and more autocracy. And when people don't know what autocracy is, because they didn't have a good civics education, people don't even know what they're buying into. So I think right now we're at a deficit. All children across races, across income groups are at a deficit because we just have a thorough lack of knowledge of our country. We don't even know, when I was 15, I went on this trip to Europe. My sister and I were like one of 6 public school kids that were on this trip, mostly very, very wealthy kids. We went on scholarship. And in one part, they broke us up and they had us stay in Germany. We went all around Europe. And when we got to Germany, we split up and went and stayed in the homes of German families. The 15-year-old boy who was in the family I stayed with knew more about American history than most Americans I had ever met. He knew everything about our history and their own. And they had a comfort in discussing their own history, the worst part of their history, the Nazi era, which the dad at dinner was comfortable talking about, and talking about it even though it was a generation that was memorable, unlike enslavement, which unless you have a great-great-grandparent who's still alive, and some people might, right? So the reality is that this dearth of a proper functioning, realistic history that doesn't have to be an indoctrination of America, but it needs to be real. And we need to have civics that lets people understand. I spend every weekend on my show re-explaining impeachment, because people don't understand that impeachment doesn't mean Trump gets fired. It's an indictment. I keep calling it an indictment to put it in sort of regular people language, because people really think if you impeach him, he will go away. That is not how it works, and people don't know that. I had a great civics teacher. I had great teachers, but not everybody did. So I agree with you that we need to, as a country, not even just one party, people need to be brave about talking about whether or not there needs to be a national curriculum that has some outside group, maybe it's AFT, maybe it's a teachers group that's independently formed, some external to government group that can sign off on it, and be the rabbis that bless it and say, this is okay, this actually is real, this actually is authoritative and can be taught to our kids.
Thank you so much. And I would say, referencing Secretary Clinton's remarks, that democracy is not a spectator sport. Between our public schools and also our unions, you see like a lifespan of how we inculcate democracy into our citizens. It's hands-on learning. And the reality is there has never been a time when civics education has been widespread and in all of our schools. However, there are people who are committed and try to teach it through different classes, and I want to point out that there is an online platform called Share My Lesson, where the nation's civic teachers, among teachers of other different disciplines, post their curricula. It's peer-reviewed. Some of the best materials rise to the top, and so it is widely available for people to use, and it's also accessible beyond just educators. It's also free to use, so that's Share My Lesson.
Thank you. My name's Alice Johnson Kane. I am a freshman legislator in the Maryland General Assembly. And I am proud to be a member of the most female, most diverse freshman class in the history of our state. Thank you. And I will say, many, if not most of us, never expected to run for office until 2016 happened. And we felt the need to step up at this moment in time. My question is around perhaps my biggest fear after the 2016 election, which is that this crazy, upside down, completely abnormal world that we're living in every day would start to feel normal to people. And that people who stepped up in the immediate aftermath after the election would go back to their day-to-day lives at some point and disengage. Some of the people, like the Indivisible folks, who were very active in my community. And I am starting to see that happen at exactly a moment we can't afford for it to happen. So my question is, what do we do to keep the pressure on and to keep the local activists engaged in a meaningful way until we feel like our democracy is back on track? Thank you.
Sure. Absolutely. I guess I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. I think, for us, we've thought about it as sort of training and leadership development, as community, and as efficacy. Right. So one thing is, a lot of people who became politically active kind of went from 0 to 60, and, sort of going back and making sure that they have support, that they have skills, that they're trained, and like how exactly are you organizing? A lot of times when we're talking about burnout or like how you lose volunteers, it's not that they were like doing a zillion things and they got really tired. It's that like they went to a bad meeting where somebody held the mic for a really long time and they didn't go back to the next meeting. And so it's stuff like, how do you actually organize and build the kinds of places where people can get regularly engaged and developed as leaders? Second piece is community. I think that one of the things that we've seen most strongly is that the people who are still going are people who have strong social ties to other people who keep them going. And that both changes the patterns of how you engage, and it changes your identity in a meaningful way, so that being an activist is part of your identity. Calling your member of Congress is a thing you do along with like brushing your teeth or going to the gym. And the third is efficacy. So one of the things that has been really important to us, like obviously we're a national organization, but we're not like, we're all doing this one national thing and that's the thing we're doing and nothing else. It's really, really important for people to be seeking out the opportunities and the things that they can have an impact on in wherever they are, and finding those victories in a whole range of different places. And just like recognizing that one of the things that keeps people going is, it's not necessarily like you're not going to get Trump out of office next week, but you might have, for example, I was just hearing about a local group that's had the first gay pride parade ever in their small town in Tennessee. And so the kinds of victories that people have and the ways that they feel themselves building power can look like a lot of different things. And I think it's really just encouraging sort of keeping those communities active and keeping them finding ways to change something.
Building on what Leah said, when I've been interviewing a lot of activists around the country and trying to figure out how active they still are, a lot of these special elections that have been happening in the off season at the state level and at the local level, a lot of people I said, like, we really need a win now and then to keep our people involved so that they feel like there's some hope and that they're making some difference. Because if you just see loss after loss after loss, I think it can get a little bit dispiriting. But, Democrats have had wins, in quite a few of these special elections, not all of them. But I think it's been enough to keep a lot of people going. We've heard from our readers, like and I'm sure you all feel this reading the news too. You sense some fatigue. You can't take that inundation of bad news every single day, or what Trump is doing again. And, we see cycles when our readers start to tune out a little bit, and we watch very closely what stories they're reading and what stories they aren't. And they like stories about good news now and then, in addition to, this is outrageous that Trump is doing this. So I think, making sure that people have both, like, here is the urgent reason you need to stay involved, and here's some hope of why things can actually go better, really helps.
I just say that when we get power, we have to do something, and we have to have an impact on people's lives. And that is one of the reasons why the kind of operating premise of this panel, which is that you have to pay attention to these structural issues that get in the way. If we don't do that, if there's a decent chance we'll get back even more power in the next cycle. We certainly got some at the state level. And if you produce for people, then they stay engaged. If you don't, they don't think government works for them. And so it seems to me that actually accomplishing something or having a very compelling story about why you haven't is crucial.
Can I just comment on that real quick? And one of the things that I think is absolutely true about what you said is the risk that Democrats, I think that this is a risk to the Democratic Party, is even if Democrats are manage to take back the White House, let's say they run the table and they take back the Senate and the White House, if they fundamentally try to operate within the same system, presuming that the system fundamentally works and that the only problem with it was Donald Trump, and then if you take Donald Trump out of the picture, suddenly the system will kick back into some sort of normalcy, I think that's a huge mistake, because so much has been degraded about the way government works. The Senate no longer functions. I think one person who fundamentally saw that was Senator Harry Reid, who got yelled at basically by Democrats for saying, finally, we have to actually change the structure of the way the Senate works, because even in the minority, Mitch McConnell was almost able to stop any progress that President Obama tried to make, which is why DACA is not a law, it's an executive order. And those are not durable because they change with the president, and you've seen that Donald Trump's whole mission in life seems to be to undo anything that that President Obama did, even the deal with Iran, which was designed to prevent us from going to war. So I would warn Democrats not to to be lulled into the false security of winning, because when you win, to your very point, that you have to actually do something. And I think that you have to also, as the other side uses their lurid imagination about what they can do with power, Democrats need to be a lot more creative about what they can do with power. Don't be reluctant the way Democrats typically are when they get power to just stay in the system and keep it going and keep the car moving. You're going to have to reconstruct the car, because Republicans have completely torn up the road. And you're not going to be able to get anything done the way the system is now.
I would just add, I find myself kind of going to medical metaphors on a lot of this stuff, where it's like, okay, so we are having a heart attack, but we also have cancer, and we have to like get through the heart attack, and then we have to take on the cancer. And I think that, just to echo Joy and Guerra's points, the additional long-term political threat to democracy and to a healthy system is sort of the delinking of who wins elections from any kind of results in people's lives. We have a political system that is designed to block change and to like make it very easy for obstructionists to stop pretty much anything that they would like to stop. And we also have a political system that rewards them for doing that right now. You saw that with Mitch McConnell's strategy all through the Obama years, where he accurately assessed that he could make Barack Obama pay a political price for blocking the things that would have mattered and been good to people. I have this like very vivid memory from the 2010 election of I took off time and worked on the campaign of my boss. We were pretty much always going to lose, but we tried. And basically we were in a district that had 20% unemployment, and we were going door to door talking to people about the fact that their unemployment benefits, which had been extended originally under the stimulus, were expiring, and how we would like to extend their unemployment benefits more, but Republicans wouldn't let us. And like, I was just thinking there, like, we have 59 votes in the Senate, and we have the Democratic majority in the House, and we have the most, like, this president who's won in a landslide. And my political pitch is like, in principle, I would like to help you, but I do not have the power to do so. Like, no wonder we got creamed, So, like, this is a real, if we don't have a political system that actually, like, allows us to shift power and then reworks the sort of structural impediments that are holding us back and then allows us to actually deliver for people, then there will be continued loss of faith in government.
And to that very point, I'm sorry, now we're off on a tangent, but we can't get off it. That is exactly right. I mean, I remember writing a post literally because I was getting every day people angry at President Obama that he hadn't changed everything in his first year of government, and saying Democrats had 60 votes, why didn't they do anything? Forgetting Democrats only had 60 votes for about 5 months. That they only got to 60, which they needed to pass any bill, when Senator Franken finally won a lawsuit to get his seat, because even after he won the election, the Republicans sued to try to take it back. And so in that 5 months, if you think about what the Democrats were able to do between getting their votes and the lame duck, the amount of stuff that got done, overturning DOMA, the health care bill that had been 100 years in the making, Harry Truman couldn't do it, FDR couldn't do it, the fight by the medical establishment and the insurance establishment was so strong. And so then the result of not being able to do anything, even when you have the majority, is that Democratic-leaning voters say, well, democracy doesn't work. What's the point of voting? I don't get anything when they win. And then that's a vicious cycle that actually makes Democrats lose again. So people stay home because they're like, well, you're not even effective. Why am I bothering voting for you? And if you think about the place where Republicans have been the most effective at using this tactic, it's on the Supreme Court. You had Mitch McConnell literally deem that the first black president of the United States did not have the right to nominate a Supreme Court justice, completely throwing the Constitution in the garbage, and held that seat and said that if Secretary Clinton had won, Republicans said they would have held that seat for 8 years if they had to prevent Secretary Clinton as president from putting it in. Think about that. And when they finally jammed Gorsuch on, then to get Kavanaugh on, who we now know told some things in his nomination that turn out, per the New York Times report, to maybe not have been true. He had a 1-week investigation. He won by 50 to 48. One vote was not there, did not show up, so there was a non-vote, and the 50th vote was by Senator Murkowski of Alaska, a Republican, who couldn't bring herself to vote for him, so she voted present. Rather than getting 51 votes, which is typically what you need to become a Supreme Court justice, he only got 50. It was not a tie. The Vice President Pence did not break a tie to make him the lowest vote member of the Supreme Court in history. He won without 51 because the rules that the Senate decided were that a vote of present was going to count as yes. That's just the rules. So you talk about norms, Republicans don't care about the norms. They don't care about the rules. They will do anything to have power. And so Democrats need to get this through your head. A normal election and normal politics and even winning won't stop them because they don't believe that Democrats have any right to have power. They fundamentally believe in the right to rule. There's a monarchical sense in one of our political parties. And I say this as somebody whose father was a Reaganite. The Republican Party has changed to a party that actually believes that they have the right to eternal rule. And so if the other side, and that's independents and Democrats and the majority, don't get that through your heads and try to have normal politics, y'all gonna lose, and then you're gonna lose the most fundamental rights that you have.
So thank you so much, everyone. I wish we had time to take everyone's questions in here. Hopefully the panelists will be able to hang out a little bit and individually answer your questions. I want to leave people on the note that this has been an extraordinary conversation. You all have such deep experience and wisdom on these issues. But I am an organizer and a campaigner and a trade unionist, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell you, you all have a responsibility coming out of this discussion, which is to not let the information and urgency sit with you. And I hope you will all commit to it. Go out and talk to your households and talk to at least 10 people you know and make sure that they understand that their role cannot be taken for granted in these times. So again, thank you, Joy, Amanda, Guerra, Leah. It's so important that we have you out there. Please keep doing what you do. Thank you.
So before people start moving, let me just tell you what the process is. Lunch is upstairs in the ballroom on the 3rd floor directly above us. Senator Wyden is showing up there at 12:15, okay, to talk about his Election Security Act. We have an hour and a half, so there's no rush. There's time for you to sit and eat and converse with each other. And then we're back down here at 1:30 with Attorney General Holder, Mayor Gillum, Maria Teresa Kumar, and Ari Berman to talk about voter suppression.